Hi, class. Welcome back. We're now in Chapter 8, The Growing Rock Monster. Now, this chapter and the next is going to primarily deal with music from the 1970s. Now, in general, the 1970s is seen as a decade of retreat, a retreat from the revolutionary ideas, social revolution of the 1960s. However, we're going to see those seeds that were planted in the 60s actually expand in the 1970s and have a great social effect. Now, one of them is the anti-war movement. And we do actually see finally an end to the Vietnam War in 1973. Unfortunately, the way it ended was with the evacuation of Saigon. Now, and also the change in the end of the 1960s to the 70s was a growing conservatism in the public. And this was a reaction to the hippie and free love movement that had been occurring through the 1960s. And that showed with the election of an unlikely winner at that point and making his comeback, Richard Nixon. Failed in 1960 for the election and a former vice president. Now, through his first term, he was still dealing with Vietnam. And of course, the social movements that were put in place and observations of the Nixon White House in their second term and the fear of the government seemed to take hold with the Watergate scandal, eventually leading in 1974 with Richard Nixon being impeached and leaving the White House and Ford taking over. Now, the music from that period, a couple of these bands that you're going to see in this chapter planted their seeds in the late 1960s and become some of the biggest bands in the 1970s. And those are Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, highly influenced by the same hard edge electric blues from Chicago, from like Chess Records, that influenced the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton from Cream, right? So they bring it back with an even harder edge. So what you're actually seeing as you go through this chapter is the beginning of what is going to be called hard rock and then heavy metal. Now, the other things that seem to occur during the 1970s is the expansion of these environmentalist movements. And we see the impact of environment mostly in the late 1970s in two major incidents that caught the public's attention. One being the Love Canal up in New York, which is the famous abandoned canal that had been turned into a waste dump for a corporation and then built over with a school directly on top of it. And the displacement eventually had to rehouse all those people after incidents of cancer and other diseases. The other one, which was closer to where I lived, in southern New Jersey and Philadelphia, was the famous 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor meltdown incident, which I actually recall from when I was a child. That was in 1979. Now, it shows the panic of people of the 1960s. They think, finally, here it is, what we've been warning you about. And also, for the civil rights movement, with the Civil Rights Act of 1968, some of those wars finally start getting won. And you see the influence in television with offshoot shows like The Jeffersons and Good Times. The two of those significantly, The Jeffersons being a spin-off from All in the Family, which also was a very unique TV show. And it showed the plight between the hippie movement and that older generation. Now, The Jeffersons, it showed the upward mobility of African Americans in society. And it also showed things that had been never seen on television, like interracial couples, right? And Good Times, showing the plight of African Americans in poorer neighborhoods. So even though we look back and go, 1970s, yeah, okay, well, whatever. I remember it, the fake wood paneling, all the earth tones, I remember. But the thing is, during that period, those things start to make their way into popular mainstream culture. And it starts to empower, as we'll see, African Americans and give rise to all new kinds of rock pop, the androgyny of David Bowie. Even jazz artists like Miles Davis start experimenting heavily with rock and electric sounds, creating a whole new genre of music now known as fusion. Or pop and blues influenced artists like Steely Dan experimenting and using jazz influences, like from guys like Miles Davis, and putting it into a pop music format. These are just a few of the artists and expansion. To me, when I look back at the 70s, it is one of the most exciting decades for the expansion of music and arts that now has an immensely and lasting impact. Because that mid and late 70s era is going to bring us heavy metal, hip hop, and all new forms of jazz, R&B. All right? Now, enjoy this chapter, and I'll see you in the next, and we'll keep talking about the 1970s. In the next one, get your disco shoes on. We're going to be ready to do it.